professor of public policy and political science, and it's my pleasure, indeed my honor, to be here today and be able to introduce and kind of launch what's really going to be not formal presentations, but kind of a conversation between our two distinguished guests. They do fall in that category of needing no introduction. For all of the people in the room, need for many more people, let me simply say that Gordon Giffin is former United States ambassador to Canada, and also a Duke alum. We put the ambassadorship first, but sometimes we're not sure of that. That's right. And Lloyd Axworthy, who knows the foreign minister of Canada, and the president-elect of the University of Winnipeg. Is that right, or are you actually president-elect? You have to assume new responsibilities moving from UBC to the University of Winnipeg. We talked the other day on the phone with some guidance from Scott, and both Lloyd and Gordon really thought that they wanted to do this, not as formal presentations, but as a kind of conversation. So I thought I'd kind of pose maybe a couple of questions to get us started, and then maybe ask you folks if there's questions you want to pose and get some responses in. And both of our guests have expertise not only on the full agenda of U.S.-Canadian issues, but really the global context of these issues as well, both directly and indirectly. So I thought I might just ask each of you, maybe Lloyd, if you go first, to just sort of take stock of the overall relationship between the United States and Canada, both as it relates to bilateral issues and also sort of to the global issues that are parts of the relationship between the two administrations.
Thanks, Bruce, and let me say hello to everybody, and many who I know and some who I don't. This is a little bit like old times, where Gordon and I would get together for lunch to talk about some serious matter of state, and in about 2 minutes we were talking politics. And that was usually the most relevant part because it was the driving wedge that in many cases determined the nature of that relationship. I was a little bit more restricted in those days. I was always been given a mound of briefing notes that said the U.S. ambassadors coming to visit, make sure that you were properly constrained, circumspect, deferential, courteous, hospitable, and all those other kinds of things. I've since, of course, now feel totally liberated from all those requirements. And in fact, just if I have share with the group, just to demonstrate how liberation has its joys, but also sometimes its pratfalls. I was asked to talk at a university in Taiwan a few months back, and at the course of the end, the young man got up and asked me a question and said, look, you were foreign minister in Canada for 5 years, you dealt with the most powerful country in the world. Do you have any advice for us about living next door to a big, powerful country? And I immediately looked at my briefing notes. They weren't there. So I found myself totally on my own, so I kind of dug into my roots and said, well, back in Manitoba, we had an old saying that it's like making love to a porcupine, do it carefully. I don't think it translated to Chinese all that well. But in fact, I knew it because next morning I went to one of these power breakfasts they have in Taipei, where people get up early in the morning and sort of rub shoulders and make deals. And I came in and I knew there was something a little bit off stray because the body language was not too welcoming. Like nobody was looking at me. So I said to my host, was there something I've done or said? And the guy said, well, there was a story in this morning's newspaper about your speech last night. He said, well, what did they say? And he said, well, you were responding and trying to describe your relationship with the United States and what advice you give to us, and you said it was like making love to a concubine. So for those of you who have, from time to time, in the audience, question my credentials on hard or soft power, you can take that as whatever meaning you want to. Which is only to say that I welcome the chance to talk politics with Gordon, because I think that should be the starting point. At the end of this month, our new Prime Minister will meet with your President to have their first official session. I think they had a little brush block in Monterey a month or so ago, a couple of months ago. But this will be the first time in which the agenda will be there and the briefing notes will be prepared and all the sort of rigmarole will be attached. And of course, our country is full of all kinds of blandishments about what should be said and what should be done. Usually sort of from the cognoscenti around Ottawa, who are usually described as lobbyist interest groups, and the defense industry, who are already out there with their full shopping list about who, where, what, and when. I would think that it'd be an interesting engagement for the two leaders because they share certain things in common. Certainly their poll numbers are dropping substantially, and prospects for the next election aren't quite as sure as I thought they might have been a few months back. But even, I think more substantively, and this is where I think it comes to the gist of your question, Bruce, both of them in their own different way have to deal with the shadow of Iraq, of post-Iraq, the kind of situation we're in right now. I don't have to describe to an American audience the kind of issues that President Bush faces. He was certainly forthcoming the other evening about his resiliency and staying the course. It was, if you might reminiscent, I guess, of the old Uncle Remus story, the tar baby. The more action you take, the more you get stuck. But there were within his comments certain clues about if I was giving advice to the Canadian Prime Minister, it should be picked up on because embedded, maybe that's the wrong word, but embedded within those commentaries he made were certain propositions about how he sees himself getting unstuck, or how the United States sees itself getting unstuck, how it can exit, how it can transfer, how it can begin to apply itself. And there was a call, as I certainly read it, for, once again, a more active involvement of a broader international community commitment. And I think that should be the starting point of a serious discussion between Canadian and the American leader, because it goes back to the war itself, where, as you probably know, most Canadians are still sighing great sort of expressions of relief, the fact that our previous Prime Minister didn't go to the war. But we haven't developed a policy since then. We don't have a post-Iraq war strategy, position, other than to say, duck your head and stay below the parapets. And yet I think if you took President Bush's commentary, there's an opening for both demonstration of friendship, alliance, comity, based upon long-standing Canadian practices and principles that I think could be the course of a major discussion, because in effect, if there is to be a broader recognition that the horrendous events that are taking place in the Middle East represent a real risk of instability, turbulence for all of us. And I was against the war, but I am not against the fact that there is now a necessity to deal with the aftermath of it, and therefore we should deal with it properly. And if you're going to get the United Nations in, you're going to have somebody be your political, I guess we used to call him a political advance man in New York, to start laying some groundwork under which there could be an agency for the United Nations to take over more authority, more responsibility, which they will have to do. I do not believe that the United States itself can solve the problem by itself, or with the limited coalition it now has in that area. It's going to need a broader international involvement and engagement. Canadians can help in that. We've done it before, we know how to do it. We know how to do the peacemaking and the peace building. We've worked in the Kosovos and the East Timors. There's a track record that could be applied. There's a political track record that could be useful. I'm not saying that we can be the wagon master, but they can play a useful role. We have a former ambassador to the United Nations who a year ago this time attempted to be helpful in the whole debate by providing a compromise proposal on inspections. It wasn't taken up at the time, but the same kind of leadership that could be shown. So if you're going to have an international authority to take some responsibility, someone has to make the case. Someone has to provide the political leadership. Someone has to apply its skills, and I happen to believe my own country is capable of doing that when and if and how it wants to. It hasn't made that decision yet. it does carry on. And clearly the key issue to that is that you will not get any form of UN involvement or major NGO involvement in the reconstruction until you provide them with security. And that security can't simply be provided by U.S. Marines or U.S. Army or British Tommies. There's going to have to be blue helmets. There's going to have to be a constabulary. There's going to have to be a force specifically dedicated to the protection of United Nations personnel activities. And you can broaden that out to include Medicine Frontier and CARE and all the rest of them who would be there and who are also very much agents of reconstruction. It's a lesson that we learned over a difficult time, but you can build partnerships, you can build arrangements by which you can pull together the international community, not just other governments, but also a much broader partnership. But it has to be done under the right conditions and under the right circumstances. And I think that we can do that. I think we should have that kind of a discussion about how we offer. And I'll just make this final point. I think it would also then set a precedent for a broader discussion, which I think we have to have, not just with the United States, but with other countries, about how to deal with the broad issue of intervention. Intervention in difficult civil wars, intervention in abuses of human rights, interventions for the prevention of spread of weapons of mass destruction. There is a real issue out there under what circumstances, under what rules, under what principles, under what procedures do you have the right to intervene. We again have, through a commission that we established in 2000, put forward a concept. I won't go into it in detail. I think Gord knows about it because he was around at the time. That we said that it's time to establish a new principle of dealing with intervention called the responsibility to protect, to prevention, to react to conflict, and to deal with post-conflict situations. That responsibility is basically if the government or the governing authority can't provide the protection or won't provide it, or itself is the author of the problem, then the international community has a responsibility to become involved. And then it sets out the tests and the criteria and so on. It's being actively debated as I speak at the United Nations as a basis for a General Assembly resolution coming in this fall. There is some traction developing around the idea. It would be a very important discussion to have with the President of the United States, and not just the President, but maybe the next President, or all those on both sides of the House and the Chamber, because it begins to address what will also be an issue of enormous concern to the United States, whether it's worried about weapons of mass destruction or the advancement of democracy. You have, if you're going to intervene, you better do it according to rules. I think we've got some rules we could put in place. I think we could demonstrate how those rules could be applied in the post-conflict turbulence in Iraq. That should be the major gist of our discussion between the two leaders of these two countries so that we can find a basis for working together on a problem that I think besets us all.
What was the question? Oh. It is a delight and honor to be here with Lloyd. We did oftentimes have opportunities, both privately and publicly, to discuss the Canada-U.S. relationship, both in a bilateral and a global context, and it was one of the thrills of my tenure in Ottawa to get to know Lloyd and to watch him work. I uncharacteristically agree with much of what you just said. To sort of bring it back to a more narrow Canada-U.S. context, what you just suggested that Canada engage in, and I'll put it in shorthand, is to be a catalyst for resolution of the current global dilemma at which the United States is at the center, I think would be a remarkably positive step by Canada, both for the world and for the bilateral relationship, because one of the great things that I fear in the Canada-U.S. relationship is that Canada is becoming incrementally less and less relevant to the United States. I hate to say that. I'm a person who lived 17 years of his life in Canada as a young man and had the honor of serving as our representative to the government of Canada. But the Canada, in my judgment today, in dealing with the United States, tries to walk an impossibly fine line on one hand of maintaining the best friend relationship for economic purposes, and so that people can sell everything they make and travel to the United States whenever they choose unencumbered. So to make sure on the economic side that relationship is maintained. But when it comes to sort of the global engagement, to distinguish themselves from the United States as much as possible. And I think that's an awfully difficult line to walk. It's sort of as if the assumption is made that nobody down here knows it. And while I will say that not enough people in the United States, either in my government generally, I don't mean this government, any government, not enough people in our U.S. government pay attention to Canada, and that needs to be addressed with no doubt. And the reverse of that is that people in Canada obsess about the United States. I used to kiddingly tell people in the embassy, I said, how about let's see if we can just set up a deal where 1 week out of every month Canada obsesses about some other country. So our goal should be to go to the Department of Foreign Affairs and see if we can't strike that deal. Pick any other country, it can be random countries, but just obsess about another one. And so I use a metaphor of looking at the same thing through the opposite ends of a telescope. Canada looks at it where the relationship is so magnified, where from the United States end they're looking at it as much more distant. I do think, and I'm being, I'm giving advice to Canada, I'm not paid to do that, but wasn't paid to do it when I was on the government payroll. I was supposed to. I think there's a challenge here that Canada doesn't, in a coherent way, it hasn't in some time tried to define for itself, not taking into account what the U.S. wants, but for itself, what Canada wants the relationship to be. Does Canada want it to be best friends, closest allies, with the attributes that come with that? That doesn't mean sycophant, it doesn't mean agree all the time, but it does mean that concept has some value, or does it not? And there's no right or wrong answer. It's just that I think all of the other decisions then flow from that judgment, and the decision should be put in a rational framework of what the policy goal is in dealing with the United States, as opposed to random ad hoc. What do we do on this issue, either globally or bilaterally? And I think that requires some debate in Canada, because there are different schools of thought, certainly in Canada, and I think a national conversation on the relationship with the United States and all that entails, it would be worthwhile to see if a relative consensus could be developed. I think there needs to be a national conversation in the U.S. As well, which is more difficult, but the last thing I'll say, and give you another chance to contribute here, Bruce, is that it's interesting that with inanimate objects like lumber and some non-human animate objects like cattle and pigs, we've decided that it's a continental relationship, that you ought to be able to move lumber from British Columbia without there being duties on it, which I agree. And that you ought to be able to move cattle and pigs back across the border, and if a cow is born in Alberta with a disease, it's a continental problem, it's not a Canadian problem, and I agree with that. But we don't look that way on all of the other issues. We need to go beyond inanimate objects and cattle and pigs and recognize that we have a continental relationship today. With all of the complications that we're confronted with, the simple stuff's been done. NAFTA, in retrospect, is pretty simple when you look at it, not far-reaching particularly, and it's also 16 years old. We haven't done much about the relationship other than when forced to by events of 9/11. So, anyway, you thought you got started.
Well, one other question that we'll take some from the group. It's interesting, I was listening the other night to Zbigniew Brzezinski was on television, and Brzezinski, classically was known as a geopolitical strategist, and in his new book, as well as a lot of his commentaries, he's become someone that's paying much more attention to the broader global agenda, many things that you've worked on. And he was making the argument that, as we focus on a priority issue like, terrorism, Iraq, whatever, there is this sort of opportunity cost for sort of the rest of the global agenda, the trade issues, the environmental issues. And at one level, it's a sort of an obvious answer that, it's, well, the inbox is full, and, but it's sort of a classical problem. And, from both your perspective, whether it's the issues that were a little bit more long-term in the bilateral relationship, or thinking about the global issues, how do we try, through both of our countries, either individually or collectively, to pay attention to issues and, not just when there are immediate crises, but to have this broader perspective. Otherwise, we end up with doing everything at the 11th hour and that sort of thing.
Let me just kind of two ways. One problem I always felt that we had, and Gordon alluded to it, is that we have run and still do Canada-US relations first on a transaction basis, on the basis of looking at architecture and structures along the way. I'm not saying to do that every day, but we haven't really, as he said, after 16 years old, we haven't really looked beyond that to say how do we deal with the cross-border issues surrounding that, things like water, energy, climate change, migration, employment patterns. There's all kinds of issues out there that have no structure whatsoever. We have 280 treaties between us. Virtually none of them have any kind of dispute resolution mechanism. They're all reactive. They have no preemptive planning, no sense of anticipation, other than things like the International Joint Commission, which again has been allowed to fallow simply because the effort hasn't really been, heavy effort hasn't been made to put it, give it an authority and a jurisdiction to really deal with a lot of the cross-border issues that are there, including ones that I think are emerging as real security issues. Saying to Gordon and Bruce over lunch, my own sense is increasingly the issue of North American water supply quality is going to be a security issue. We're running out of it in key areas, particularly in the western part of the continent. The quality is running down. I mean, the science on the aquifers on the west coast is really becoming very dangerous. Nobody's talking about it. And part of the problem is that some of our modalities, political science modalities, are old-fashioned. We're still talking about integration. We haven't really kind of jumped forward and said, what's the nature of a North American relationship? And that's where I would take maybe one step further. I think that you have to talk about the North American footprint, not just the Canada-US footprint. I think the degree of integration is taking place between the three countries. We did start something of that kind. In a way, Rosario Green, who was Secretary of State, and Madeleine Albright and I started meeting in 1997 on a trilateral basis. It was the first time that senior ministers from the three countries had ever got together regularly. We met, Paul, 4 times a year, I guess, 3 or 4 times a year. And it was just conversation about international issues. We started meeting at the UN over dinner, and then we moved to Santa Fe, and then we moved to other places and then we would convene at summit meetings. And we certainly began to broaden the agenda, and we realized, and this security became a very critical debate and discussion, because we realized that whether it was dealing with border issues, whether it was dealing with drugs, whether it was dealing with illegal migrants coming in, whether it was dealing with the terrorist issue, which is just emerging in our consciousness around 1997, that we had a lot of things that we had to work out together, but that the old machinery, the old institutions, didn't give us the capacity, the ability. It's the old classic case of new risks, old institutions. And we started to work on some of them. We took the IJC and kind of converted it into a water management system on cross-border watersheds. There was a lot of sort of static about that, both within the three bureaucracies, who didn't like it very much. And also, I found, for example, and I say this because we're in the university setting, when we went to the pantry to look at the academic work, it was zilch. It's improved since then. I know the Hughesman organization and others are doing work on it, but there was nothing. I mean, we were, as policymakers, we were simply scraping. And in fact, we were generating our own policy stuff that we were pushing out, as opposed to the other way coming back in. That's since been dropped. Since 9/11, all those efforts at trilateral cooperation are basically been dropped. And the websites and the intergovernmental meetings and the commissions that we're working on, we did everything from looking at continental education programs, to security issues, to issues related to women's rights and Aboriginal rights. 9/11 became the great cliff off of which this stuff was dropped in the trough. And I'm not saying that it's the answer. I'm simply saying that it was an attempt to get a new institutional base. And what we wanted to do is we didn't want to do the European Union integrated model where we all became one big happy family with sort of continental institutions. Because we realized that in a three-way relationship with the most powerful country in the world, that's an uneven, imbalanced relationship. The European model wouldn't work. We had to find something that would allow each country to maintain a degree of its, I guess I always use the example of a condominium, that you have shared property, but you're allowed to decorate your own unit. And that's the sort of model we try to build into the system. Gordon was part of this discussion, but it's come to a dead end. And I guess partly my plea or case to make is that those who are both in the policy side, in the academic side and in the interest group side, need to be thinking a little bit about the institutional architecture that we need. And the reason I said in my opening remarks that I think that a discussion between Mr. Martin and Mr. Bush, then the month should lay some groundwork for that. They're not going to get there, but I think that's why I use the whole issue of intervention, where I think we do have a value add as Canadians because we've done some real work on that. Could be put out there for a real discussion amongst our North American partners to begin with, and see what we can then develop, because you've got two of your partners who didn't agree with you on the war. This would be a good chance to have a discussion, but where do you go next on intervention?
The conundrum that I try to work through is I actually see differences of challenges, sort of the infrastructure of how we operate the shared geography is one thing, and whether we need more institutions, I think is a very good question. But my feeling about the Canada-US dynamic is one that isn't a product of the geography. The geography, to me, is an accident in this context. And so for what I'm trying to think about is, Mexico is not necessarily a rational or an immediately likely participant in the dialogue. And I say that because Canada's engagement with the U.S. Throughout our existence as countries has been one that's much broader than the fact that we are geographically next door to each other. And that's why I believe that Canada being a catalyst for addressing the challenges in the Middle East right now would restate that very proposition that Canada and the U.S., for a lot of important reasons that are bigger than trade, that are bigger than geography, have been partners in the world for quite some time. Not that we've always agreed with each other, but in many times when there's been a challenge, Canada and the U.S. have been together on trying to resolve it. And there were plenty of times back in the 80s during Mr. Siegel's administration where Brian Mulroney was within the world community a catalyst that brought parties together that otherwise wouldn't have been brought together, including the United States and Europe. And I think that's an extraordinary role that Canada has played and can continue to play that doesn't come as a function of the geography. It comes as a function of common principles, common goals, common ideals. One of the things I think we've got to get away from, the U.S., is all of a sudden we're back to a point where we believe, I don't know if we believe, but we act as if our role in the world is justified by the power of our military, not the power of our ideals. And that's not what we're about, and that's not what has brought us together with Canada over the years, and we got to get back to that. And I think that the Prime Minister, whether in the meeting with President Bush or otherwise, began to be part of the catalyst role that Canada's played historically, that would make remarkable progress in the way the bilateral relationship works.
I'd just like to make one footnote comment to what Gordon said. I think we also have to be a little more analytical about the so-called commonality of values. That's changing. That there are increasing shifts going on in terms of the attitudes towards international matters, to social matters, to even economic matters. And in some ways, if you go back to the Pew Global Study that was done just this past year, I think you would know this material very well. We've done some work at our own institute on it. That if you look at values, that increasingly we're not in sync with a lot of the shared values that many Americans have, or values that are being expressed in the political system. And I'm not saying that in anger or regret, it's just a reality that there is real changes going on. And that's part of the reason why that there is at this time a little bit of combustion working around the area. And that's why I'm a little bit more of an institutionalist, because the way you deal with differences is you find the right mechanism, the right process, the right procedure. You know, to give examples, and it creates a problem for any Canadian leader. Mr. Martin will be going into an election sometime in the next, well, we thought it was next week, but it might be delayed due to unforeseen circumstances. Or actually foreseen circumstances, we're calling appropriate. What he has to deal with is an increasing perception amongst Canadians that they have, that their confidence factor in having a foreign policy, an international policy, is very much geared to the dilemma you talked about, of also having a balance with the economic, integrated, not just economic, because it's a huge resource issue, it's a people issue, it's a big cross-border issue, wanting to be cooperative and compatible, but at the same time disagreeing fundamentally with the decisions being taken in Washington about the way the world should work. And those aren't sort of simply political sort of aromas. Those are deeply embedded in some real differences in values about the way. And some of them are natural. If you're a smaller country next to a big one, multilateralism is one of the ways you protect yourself. But I think it also goes to the notion, I mean, we're much more Rooseveltian right now than many Americans are, in terms of the view that we have of the world of having structures that provide cooperation rules and so on. And in fact, what Canadians are doing, along with others, are saying, how do we build on the Roosevelt tradition to move to a new kind of definition of that? Whereas the perception in Canada is that certainly the present administration is pulling back from that kind of conception. And that's where there's just a fundamental disagreement. And that's the dilemma that Mr. Martin will face it, depending on how he strikes that balance.
I got to stick in 30 seconds worth. I just don't agree that our values are drifting apart. I think maybe policies are different, and I think that's an awfully important distinction. I don't think the values are drifting apart, and I do think it's too easy right now in Canada to say we disagree with the Bush administration, therefore we're taking a walk. I don't, you know, whether you agree with the Bush administration or not, you get to, no question. But that doesn't mean you take a walk on the underlying relationship. And I think the values are there, and to assert that they're not, I think is a mistake. I don't think the values of the people I live with in Atlanta, Georgia are materially different than the values of the people that you will live with in Winnipeg. Policies may be different. How we implement those values may be different, but I don't think the values are material.
Pretty much out of time, but let me get one question. Okay, sorry, Michael, I'm going to pass on you. Sorry.
Hi, what do you call them values or policies? I think one of the major differences between or maybe one of the major differences between the U.S. and Canada right now is a corollary to the duty to protect, which is the phrase of the duty to prevent. What are the right mechanisms and processes for Canada to negotiate the differences on the U.S. and Canadian view on the duty to prevent, which will maintain the relevance of Canada to the U.S., but also maintain the Canadian value or policy differences, the integrity of that?
Well, I mean, right now, and let me just clarify the distinction. The commission that we established to look at the whole sovereignty intervention issue came forward with its report, which has now been circulated, and there's a fairly active diplomatic effort underway around the world. Mr. Heimbecker was leading the charge until he left his post. His successor is now doing the same. I do a lot of work in Africa these days. I'm interested in how much that concept is now building into the African Union concepts on collective security and things of those natures. It does turn sovereignty on its head, and this is where I disagree. It does define sovereignty a different way than the United States would. would define it under the present circumstances. But it also meets, I think, one of the needs, which is a sense of threat from around the world, from weapons of mass destruction, or from rogue groups, or from terrorist activities. The question is, how do you deal with it? And simply using a military answer, in the eyes of many around the world, including me, is not the only answer, where it seems to be the only sort of way in which that's being promoted presently by the United States. So how do we do it? Well, partly it's that discussion. What has not happened is we don't have that discussion in an active, engaged way with the United States. And so that if we took that concept and then take it to the next step, which is the duty to prevent or the responsibility to prevent, which I think has a very major relevance to the weapons of mass destruction discussion. Because actually in Iraq, at the debate at the United Nations, you were moving towards that, whereas you were making, as each day went by on the inspection sites, the inspection capacity was becoming more robust. There was demands to fill it out, give it more muscle. And if we read Blitz's book, that's what we're saying. We were moving, and actually there was back-channeling discussions going on to how we'd actually move into other arenas to deal with Iraq. It was an example of the most intrusive kinds of interventions ever undertaken by the international community to stop a weapon of mass destruction, which Italy at least was supposed to accept was there. But there are some real threats of that kind. And so rather than having this kind of group now that goes around in the high seas intercepting people, that's the sort of thing that, as a Canadian, I'd rather see it. Let's take it into the United States. Let's say there is a responsibility to stop transfers of dangerous weapons. Let's do it collectively. Let's do it internationally. Let's do it multilaterally. Let's have rules. Let's make decisions on those things. And we can help in doing that, to go back to Gordon's point, by showing that we have certain capacities, certain abilities, certain characteristics that allow us to do certain things in the international environment the United States can't do by dint of its very powerful sort of hegemonic status. And one of the things is to help put together multilateral partnerships around these concepts. But I'd like to see, and that's what I said in my preliminary remark, get away from all the other cross-border stuff. I mean, to me, major thing right now, the shadow that clearly affects this country, I think it's a shadow that falls across the rest of the world, is what's going to happen in Iraq. Just how far is it going to sort of spread its turbulence, which I think will provide enormous discontinuity globally. We've got to show that we can address that. I think we've got some good tools to do that right now. And that's what I hope Mr. Martin would address, and I hope Mr. Bush would listen.
The quick thing that I want to add is the trite old saying is where you stand depends on where you sit. And after the experience of 9/11, the rest of the world went back to normalcy pretty quickly. I had friends in Canada who were talking to me on the phone a month after, and they were, worrying about whether the border was going to, slow down the movement of trucks and car traffic, and there were members of Congress getting letters with anthrax in it. And I just said, you've gone back to normal too quick. Bad things are still happening, and it's a little hard to recognize sometimes in other countries the catharsis that was occurring here. But I also think that the world community right now, again, is including Canada as part of the world community, is looking at the United States askance in a number of ways, but the worst part of it is they're saying, you made your bed, you sleep in it. There's a mess that you brought about. We didn't agree with the policy, we didn't agree with the war, therefore, you guys figure out how to get out of it, and we're sort of looking with some glee at your dilemma. And I think it's appalling that the world that's so involved with the principles of multilateralism is sitting back and taking that attitude. So I think it would be terrific for the world and very important for the enhancement of the Canada-U.S. bilateral relationship. For a country like Canada, with its history and capacity and principles, to say, enough's enough. We didn't agree with the policy, we don't endorse it, but that's a little piece of history and we got to go forward. And we want to go to the UN, we want to be a force for going forward. And the frustrations that some of the other governments are expressing with respect to our government's policies are valid, but it doesn't justify passivity in the face of this kind of challenge.
we'd love to continue this, but we can't, for among the reasons is Gordon has to catch a plane. That's right.
It's not fair for
That's
me to
right.
sit for
I'll role play Gordon Giffin here, that's right. But anyway, please join me. This has been a fascinating, whetting our appetites dialogue. Thanks very much.
I'll also say that we'll be reconvening in the ballroom area, classroom area, at about 1:15 for a panel on operational matters and interpretation of law. So we'll see you back here at 2:15.